All right. Well, welcome everyone. My clock says it's right at 12 o'clock, and we still have quite a few people joining us. So we will go ahead and kind of take care of some of the housekeeping items, just kick off land management quarterly here for 2025. And then I think by the time we get started, about 3 minutes in here, most of the people should hopefully have joined us by then. So welcome once again to Land Management Quarterly, and we are on the February 2025 edition. My name is Jim Jansen. I am out of a location today without the greatest bandwidth, so I will not have my camera on, but I will have my audio on. And Anastasia Meyer is also joining us. She covers Eastern Nebraska together with me, and we work on various topics related to land management, leases, cash rental rates, and things of that nature across the entire state. If you'd like to find more information, please be aware that the cap.unl.edu/land management webpage will have additional information, including the archive programs for this. Give our media specialist a day or so, and hopefully within the next day, we'll have a recording in addition to a PDF of the slides that were presented listed up online. And a brief outline for today. So today we're going to be taking a look at trends in cash rental rates for 2024 to 2025. How do we calculate out a cash rental rate related to expectations for crop yields or current crop prices? Second part today, we'll be taking a look at lease arrangements. Anastasia will be leading some discussion on things we need to be aware of and keeping an eye out on. Also, where can we find lease forms if you need a written lease? The traditional deadline of when people typically sign those is approaching here in early March. And also we had a series of questions submitted to us. And in addition to the questions that we're going to be reviewing, we also had a couple submitted that I will try and address in our first portion here related to cash rental rates and things like that. And also, if you're a company that's joining us today, whether in the finance or land industry, please be aware that we're always looking for sponsorship for our land management outreach, whether online or in person. Feel free to reach out to us, and we always put a good plug in for good companies that like to help us out. So the first part today, we're going to be taking a look at current cash rental rates for 2024 into 2025. And I'll take the lead on this. And then here in about 15 minutes, Anastasia will take the second lead. Then we'll cover the questions. And if you are, as we're going along today, if you have additional questions, you can type them into the Q&A, and we'll try to address those at least by the end of today's presentations, or subject to what they are. Maybe Anastasia can flag them and ask me as we're going along too. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Two things to keep in mind. There are different places to find cash rental rate information. One of these since 1978 has come from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. We provide a survey 2 times a year. We do 2 publications. Our survey is done of actual people that work in the land industry, so bankers, appraisers, farm managers, people that would have firsthand knowledge on the transactions surrounding either the leasing, renting, or owning of agricultural land. The preliminary estimates typically come out in the middle of March, and the final full report comes out in late June. That has the preliminary estimates. In addition to the final report, it has things like on the characteristics of land sales. If you would like to find additional information, you can either take a look at this link that we have up on the webpage or on the presentation in front of you right now. Another option is, if you can't find it, contact your local extension office. Many of the extension offices, the office managers tend to have a copy printed off in their entryway to their office, or can get you a copy when you come in, or maybe depending on the situation, they could even mail you one. So as always, you can either go online, maybe stop by a local library if you don't have a printer, things of that nature. Many libraries can run you off a couple pages, fairly inexpensive, maybe for less than $1. So keep an eye out. Middle of March is the first snapshot we're going to be having on 2025 cash rental rates. I will try and highlight some of my thoughts related to cash rental rates, and also some ideas on how do we set a cash rent. Now, this is somewhat of a review from earlier of 2024 with Land Management Quarterly. A few things I'd like to point out here. The University of Nebraska summarizes cash rents on a per acre basis for dry land or non-irrigated cropland. In addition to irrigated cropland includes center pivot irrigated cropland, in addition to gravity irrigated, as well as pasture land or grazing land on a per acre basis, as well as cow-calf pair rental rates. The Nebraska dry land cropland rental rates that we have presented here are split into an average, which is in front of the A with a colon in the middle of each region, in addition to the average of the high third and the average of the low third. Now, the average of the high grade and average of the low grade, those are not reflecting a specific, let's say, corn yield or crop yield or rainfall amount. We asked the people that take this survey, what do they estimate the upper third of cash rent is? And we also ask them, what do they estimate the lower third of cash rent is? In addition to those two things, we ask, what is the overall average? So once again, these are not reflective. Let's say here in central Nebraska, the high third average is not specifically reflective of a particular crop yield, but they are what the people that take this survey estimate to be the upper third of cash rent is by region. Now, what influences the cash rents? Quality of the soil, configuration of the property, rainfall. Remember, the farther east you move inside of each of these regions, you tend to get more rainfall, more consistency in the rainfall. Configuration of the field. Do you have a nice square field, or do you have a field that's cut up by different geographical attributes that may slow down or make planting with a big planter or combining with a combine a little bit more difficult? The competitiveness of the area. Some areas of our state that have a high presence of livestock feeding. Do you have demand from local feedlots, for example, that may want to compete? They need the land for chopping silage or hauling livestock waste or cutting it for hay. Yes, you can haul those things a distance, but the closer you are to the site, maybe they almost plant 3 crops over a 2-year period. They might chop it for silage 1 year, plant rye, and then after planting the rye, they might cut it for hay or chop it again for silage and plant soybeans, for example. So there's a wide variety of things that influence cash rents in addition to the profitability of what we're doing out there. Well, once again, we talked about the average of the high grade, which is really the average of the high third, average of the low grade, and the overall average. I didn't present this slide here, but I will tell you for most of the cash rental rates on the cropland side, we had what I would call a mixed response. Some areas were up a little bit, some areas were down a little. These averages tend to reflect some of the differences that we've noted on cash rental rates. Switching gears here briefly over to center pivot irrigated cropland. The center pivot rental rates assume that the landlord owns the entire irrigation system, pivot, pump, and power unit. All the things we mentioned before about the cash rental rates, the quality of the land, how competitive it is, the rainfall, yes, you are irrigating, but rainfall still makes a difference on the cash rental rates. Those all influence cash rents. The rental rates presented here is just not a return on the land, but it is also a return on the improvements. So an example, if you have a tenant that's providing a portion of the irrigation system, we may discount the cash rent under the cases where the land tenant provides the pivot or the power unit. Some of our survey work we've done on this in the past would suggest that if the tenant provides the pivot as part of the irrigation system, we might see a discount of approximately $35 to $45 an acre. So an example, if we're in, let's say the South District here, and you think the cash rent should be $320 an acre, but the tenant is the one that's providing the upkeep, repairs, and maintenance on the irrigation equipment. Maybe instead of charging $320, someone might discount it, say $40 an acre. An example, $280 an acre to account for the fact that the tenant is the one required to upkeep the pivot. When they own the pivot, they're required to pay the insurance if they'd like to take that. If the tenant provides the power unit, so The landlord, let's say they own everything except the power unit, the diesel engine or electric motor. How much would we discount the cash rent to account for the fact that the tenant provides the power unit? Well, on average, our survey work would suggest around $10 to $15 an acre if the tenant provides, let's say, a diesel engine or a propane or natural gas engine. And those rates vary subject to how deep is the well and how big is the power unit and things like that. But on average, we tend to see that discount. It's not uncommon to see 10 to 15 an acre. So once again, if we are picking on the South District here for a second and we say the tenant, landlord owns everything, but the tenant is the one that brings the diesel engine along. Under that case, maybe you take off the effective cash rent. Maybe that's actually 305 an acre, not 320, because the tenant's the one providing the power unit. The tenant provides the power unit and the pivot, but the landlord owns the below ground improvements. So an example, the well, the pump in the well, the piping in the ground. Under those cases, we're talking about a situation where the discount per acre, maybe it could be closer to 50, or 40, around 35 to 45 for the pivot, 10 to 15 for the power unit. You might be talking a discount anywhere from, let's say, 45 all the way up to 50, $60 an acre. So remember, you need to have an accurate reflection on these irrigated rental rates. The rates that the University of Nebraska or the USDA reports on assumes the landlord owns the entire irrigation system. We would discount the fact that if a tenant provides a portion of the system to accurately reflect an equitable cash rental rate, a reasonable cash rental rate that reflects the contribution of both parties involved. The cow-calf pair rental rates is probably another popular one that we see. This is for one cow, one calf for 1 month during the summer grazing season. If you would graze for, let's say, 5 months, 60 times 5 would approximately be $300 a pair. So what influences grazing land cash rents? Quality of the land, expectations for rainfall. Is it a gently sloped piece of ground, but maybe it's too wet to farm? Is it highly erodible, very steep portions of the property you can only transverse by a horse? All those things influence cash rents. Competitiveness of the area. What is the landlord willing to do? What's the tenant willing to do? The big thing on grazing land is we need to negotiate different things surrounding the upkeep of fences, control of noxious weeds, brush, unwanted things. I'm not talking just about having a couple big old cottonwood trees that are good for shade, but we're talking about things that really influence the cash rental rates surrounding features to the property that provide value depending on who you are. If a land tenant is really willing to go out there and maintain the fence, what's that worth to the landlord? Well, I think most people, when you initially rent the property, you hope that it's fairly well maintained. Fences are taken care of, the weeds are controlled, things like that. If they're not, we may adjust the cash rent when the tenant uses their time, skill, equipment, talent to make those repairs. Control of noxious weeds is always kind of a sticky wicket because even if you have a great tenant, it doesn't always necessarily mean your neighbors are great neighbors that maintain their weeds. So we got to be able to negotiate that to account. The other survey that's done on cash rent is by the National Agricultural Statistics Survey, or Statistics Service. And with the USDA NASH service, these cash rents are done summarized by county. This map that you'll see on the next slide was actually summarized, I believe, in around early October, but the raw numbers, those are published usually in that late August, September timeframe. And that what we see here, and you'll notice on the prior slide and this slide, and remember our slides will be posted today. We have the website for the USDA NASH cash rent survey. And this is for dry land, cropland, or what the USDA refers to as non-irrigated cropland cash rents. You'll notice some counties are in white. If your county's in white, either there's not a lot of dry land, cropland. An example in the Sandhills, it's predominantly grazing land. If there is any cropland, it might be irrigated. And if they don't get enough responses, for example, in Antelope County, is there any driveline cropland? Yes, there is, but you have to remember we're reporting on estimates that are reflecting those responses received. And I like to point out in here, you can see when you look at some of these regions, let's look at that South District. Remember I said before, the farther east you move in each of these districts, the more rainfall you get. Well, it seems to me in the South District for example, where we go from Hastings, Harlan, Furnace, Gosper, Phelps, when you look at this breakdown on cash rents, we tend to have some of these higher cash rents somewhat in the eastern part. Some of the lower cash rents tend to be in the western part of the East District. So that's how we see that breakdown there. The irrigated rental rates assume once again that the landlord owns the entire irrigation system. And I didn't get into it in our slides here from the university, but we did highlight the cash rental rates by county. And this is a weighted average for each county where we have center pivot in addition to gravity or flood irrigated rates. The university also reports on gravity or flood irrigated rates. Just know that they tend to rent around $30 to $55 an acre or less than what the center pivot irrigated rental rates do. On the grazing land, this grazing land rental rate that's reported here is for the traditional 5-month grazing season. If the tenant is renting for something outside of this traditional season, we would reflect that in the cash rental rates that are reported here. The breakdown here, once again, in the East District, yes, we have a fair amount of grazing land in the eastern part of the state, but once again, if you don't get those numbers reported, they won't produce a number with confidence. So that's why we see some of the breakdowns the way that we do here. So the final piece here that I would briefly like to summarize before Anastasia gets started, I'm going to pitch about 2 different ideas on setting cash rents. The first idea, and I've talked about this in the past, is adjusting either the county or regional information and adjusting it to the farm level by taking what we know on the left here. So an example, what we know on the left, we have a breakdown on cash rental rates for this made up county. Let's say the county yields 180 bushel per acre. And if we take the average county corn yield, so the average county rental rate divided by the average yield, dividing the two of those together, there is a split of about $1.34 per bushel. So what this means is 180 divided by 134. This is the county rent per bushel, and it says for every bushel of grain raised on this made-up example, $1.34 is going towards the cash rent on the rented properties for corn in this made-up county. I take $1.34 per bushel, slide it to the upper right-hand corner here. And my farm, instead of yielding what the county average is of 134, my property only yields 119 bushel. If I take the county rent per bushel times the average yield, that gives me the farm level cash rent. I took what I knew on the left-hand side and applied it to what I didn't necessarily know on the right-hand side. The next thing that we have right here is we have a breakdown of taking a crop share and making it into a cash lease. So let's focus our attention here on March of 2025. On this lease, my property yields about 160 bushel per acre. Half of that yield goes to the landlord, half goes to the tenant. We think the crop's going to be worth about $4.50 bushel, so let's say 446. The difference between the landlord's share of the income minus half of the landlord's share of expenses, half the seed, fertilizer, and chemical expenses. The difference between those two is the effective return to the owner. What would I make if I rented my ground out using a crop share? Now, as you see, you look through this example here, we go from March to July and then July to November, subject to what happens to the price. And I hold the yield steady here in this example, but subject to what actually happens to the yield and price, that definitely can have an influence on some of these different things. And if I, instead of doing cash equivalent from crop share, if I do cash equivalent from hay share, If the landlord gets a third of the share of hay, so let's say this field yields 1.5 tons per acre, a third would be half a ton per acre, or let's say we get half the hay here. Subject to how much of the hay the landlord gets, they may or may not share in some of the expenses, as we note in the footnote here on this slide. The difference between these two just goes to show us that subject to how much you get versus the reward surrounding it definitely can have an influence on some of the different questions or some of the different factors that we have surrounding cash rents. And we're just asking the question once again, if I would put the hay up on share with the landlord turns around and says, why don't you just buy out my share of the hay? We're taking a crop share, or in this example, a hay share, and making it into a cash lease. Okay. All right. I see one question I want to answer here, Brett. So there's a question here. Related to farmland leases, is there a need to write possible wind turbine agreements with energy companies into the land? So an example, if you're renting out some cropland or grazing land, there's a company that wants to put in a lease, or excuse me, that wants to put in a wind turbine, for example. Should we include that in our lease? I would say you need to include some type of provision in there that if you know there's a good chance that a portion of the ground might be disrupted because they need to fence off a portion of the ground to have heavy construction equipment out there or something. There may be a greater disruption if it's cropland relative to grazing land, for example. We want to charge a cash rental rate that's going to reflect the actual use of the property. So yes, having some type of provision in there that accounts for some of those things would not be a bad thing to include. Okay, with that, I'm going to think Anastasia is going to take over screen control here. So just give her one moment and we'll have our updates on the 2025 production seasons related to lease arrangements. So Anastasia, do you want to go ahead and take lead? All right.
Okay, everyone. Can you guys see my screen? Fine. I'm not hearing otherwise, so.
Looks good.
Awesome. Thank you. So once again, my name is Anastasia Meyer. I'm on the southern side of the eastern half of the state, and Jim and I are frequently found together presenting on these topics. But I want to talk to you today about updating any agriculture leases for the 2025 production season. Okay. So with that being said, we are really encouraging people to go from a verbal or a handshake lease agreement to a written lease. Written leases protect both the tenant and the landowners and their heirs. I think in the future, we're going to have a huge wealth of transfer of land in the next future. And I think it's important to know what is currently being done on your piece of ground in case something happens to you. Do your heirs know how much to pay for rent? Do your heirs know what they should be receiving for cash rent or what they should be receiving for bills in a crop share situation? So have a written lease, please. Just a reminder, a verbal or a handshake lease in Nebraska, the state law says you rent that piece of ground for 12 months out of the year for cropland. That lease is going to start on March 1. So if you were to terminate, if you want to go from that verbal or handshake lease to a written lease, you need to give notice by September 1. You have to give 6 months notice. So you can't just change right now unless both parties were agreeable to it. Legally, September 1 is when they needed to know by. You can go ahead and terminate it now for the 2026 growing season. It's not too early for that. So if it is something that you are thinking about, start talking about it between the two parties. Explain it protects you, it protects me, it protects our heirs. And if you're needing an example of a lease, Ag Lease 101 has, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but on the side of the screen, you can actually download this, save it onto your computer, either take what you want out of it or just fill in your information, but it's a good starting point for a written lease. How you get there is you're going to go to aglease101.org. You're going to click on this document library, and that will take you to this page right here. First, we're going to cover the lease publications. If you call Jim or I and say, hey, we have a farmstead, it has a Quonset on it, it has a grain bin, whatever the case might be, we don't have the resources to do a in-depth survey every single year. So we're going to pull the data from here. It goes off of square foot. It's pretty thorough. You can look at it if this is something that you are interested in. But we're also going to give you the caveat that these are dated publications now. They're about 10 years old. So you're probably going to need to adjust the rental rate accordingly, because prices now for a new building is not the same as it was 10 years ago. But on the right hand of our screen, we have these lease forms, and you can download one for a cash rent, cropland agreement, crop share, pasture. If you're going to rent buildings, machinery, livestock, these are all fillable PDFs that you can download to your computer, or you can share it with somebody and say, hey, look at this, email it back and forth, use it, take what you want out of it, whatever the case might be for your individual situation. So it might be too late to change a verbal or a handshake agreement right now, because we are within that 6 months time frame. We're too late. It's after that September 1 date. But a lot of times in February, people have not set those cash rental rates. So talk to each other about that. Jim is hopefully going to have his new 2025 rental rates out in the next month. So it might be something to discuss. You know, are you going to wait till those are set? How are you going to set your rate? Start talking about it now. We want people to be talking to each other more than just here's your check and what do I need to be paying? Pay attention to the crop prices. I think, you know, there could be a lot of things changing in ag policy coming up here. So watch the markets, watch what's happening in the ag policy world. And also, I think it's important to remember that sometimes it's more important to maybe take a good tenant who will treat the land better than his own, or if potentially as good as his own, then maybe seeking out that highest cash rental rate. We always encourage multi-year relations. So we want a tenant and a landowner to have those many years of relationships between them, because it's going to result in better conservation of the soil. It most likely is going to result in managing weeds, insects, maintaining the fertility, because if they think that they're going to have it the next year, they're going to treat it like they're going to have it the next year. So those multi-year relationships are really key in any good leasing arrangement. Some other things I think we need to be thinking about in 2025 is, when are those lease payments due? If you are renting to somebody and asking for full payment up front, you know, that's your prerogative as a landowner. That's fine. But just know that most people are going to be paying about a 10% premium above that due to their interest rates at the bank. So maybe you consider splitting those payments. You know, maybe you have half before planting and half after planting, or right at harvest. We again are going to make the assumption that any irrigation equipment is going to be owned and maintained by the landowner. And when I say maintained, I mean really those big repairs. I frequently talk about having a clause in your written lease that says the tenant will cover the first 500 or $1,000 of repairs on that pivot. So maybe they fix a tire in a gearbox, but anything over that, is now the landowner's responsibility. They have met their deductible as a tenant, and now the landowner is going to pay for it. With that, also, you need to be able to talk to each other about what happens when the landowner potentially is away on a holiday. They're not answering their phones. It's the 4th of July, court is burning up, and the pivot goes down. Do they have the right to ask a pivot company to come in and repair it? It's going to be expensive, holiday pay, but discuss those possibilities. One thing that we're often forgetting is the stock removal. Our general rule of thumb is if it is the tenant's corn stalks, the tenant's cows, they are putting up the fences, they are taking care of the watering, let them have the corn stalks. It's not going to cause any compaction in the soil. It's good for the soil. It's good to get some residue off. Now, if they're subleasing the corn stalks, you may consider, dividing that payment out between the landowner and the tenant. Fertility is and manure management. Just a reminder that if the tenant, what, Jim?
Can you maybe kill your video just to see if it helps with the audio quality just a little bit, please?
Yep. I'll move the microphone closer to myself as well. Okay. Sorry, where was I at? Fertility. If the tenant is making some large improvements on the soil, so if they are adding lime, if they are adding a large amount of fertility, phosphorus, let's say, for example, and they're trying to build that back up in the soil, that's typically a multi-year investment. So if you are having a tenant who is paying for those expenses, you may consider doing a multi-year lease. With the lease that says, I still have the right to terminate you, to kick you off. But if you do get kicked off, and let's say lime, it's typically good for 5 years, and I have used 2 years of the lime and I'm getting kicked off now, the landowner would prorate me 60% of that lime because it is not utilized. I paid for it, but I haven't had the chance to utilize it. So therefore, we should prorate that tenant the amount back. Manure management is also something that we might want to consider limiting maybe to 1 time a year. We don't want too much manure applied on the soil for excess nutrients. Sometimes manure can cause soil to get a few more nutrients than we want, and it can really kind of throw off some absorption rates. And the biggest thing here is, we see the hunting photo. It's a passion, right? Hunting is a passion. If you want to maintain the right to access your property, to hunt, to fish, to ride your horse, to go hiking on, you have to have a written lease. And you have to have that written lease that says you maintain your right to hunt, use your land recreationally, whatever the case might be. You have to put that in the written lease. Otherwise, remember, if you are in a verbal or a handshake lease agreement on cropland, you are renting the entire use of that land to your tenant. So they could sublease it out to a hunting corporation or to somebody else. They have every right to do that in a verbal or written lease. So if you want to limit that, if you want to control it, you need to have a written lease. I also just like to point out here the Nebraska recreational use law that says if you let somebody go on your land to hunt, it's out of the goodness of your heart. You're not taking money. You don't have any dangers out there like a booby trap for the neighbor's kids. If they trip and fall in a coyote's hole, you're not going to be liable. Now, if you booby trapped it, then you're liable. But as long as you didn't take money or know of any known dangers, you're not liable for it. And so I've talked a lot about 12-month lease for cropland and for a verbal lease. I do want to point out here that pasture or grazing land is different. In a verbal lease, it is a 5-month lease in Nebraska. So cropland, we are renting for 12 months with a verbal lease. Pasture, only 5 months. That 5 months begin when the cattle enter the pasture. So if it's May 1, May 15th, or June 1, it's 5 months from that day. So because we're only renting it for 5 months, technically we don't need to give termination notice because they are already out 6 months prior. However, we do really recommend good communication between the landowner and the tenant and professional courtesy that if you know you're not going to rent to them, let them know so they can make those plans accordingly. So, hunting seasons with pastures, if you're primarily just a deer rifle hunter, you probably don't need to retain those rights. But if you want to go archery, you do. Still, have a written lease. It protects both parties. Some things to be thinking about is who controls the noxious weeds and brush in the pasture. Really, what it comes down to is who's getting that letter from the county. The landowner is going to get that responsibility to control it. However, we recommend that, when you rent a new pasture, it's in good condition and it's the tenant's responsibility to maintain it. So maybe the general maintenance of walking around, clipping cedar trees, light spraying, tenant can take care of that. But the big overhauls of pastures, the ones that's going to require a lot of work, that is going to be a landowner expense. Now, I do see a lot of agreements where the tenant will provide the labor and the landowner will provide the chemicals or the fencing materials. But again, that's going to be really dependent on the relationship between the two parties. With a pasture, I think it's really important to have a written lease because what happens when there is a fire, hail, drought? We know it takes a long time to recover from those events, if the grass is overgrazed. Do you have the right to ask them to remove their cattle early? If so, how are those payments going to be adjusted? And then our next session is going to be Ask an Expert with Jim and I bouncing back and forth between each other. Is the audio better now?
Yeah, I think Ryan said I checked with him and it sounds like it was good with him. Are you hearing me okay, Anastasia?
Yep.
I want to ask you, before we get started, we had one question come in from your section. It stated, if you have written leases that stipulate a specific ending date, is that sufficient for a lease termination without giving written notice? Or is it a good policy to give written notice anyways?
Yeah, so if you go to Jim and I's meetings in person, you will hear us say it depends a lot, right? So it's going to depend on how your lease is written. If it says that this lease terminates at the end of this contract, so let's say end of February, then yes, that is sufficient. However, I do really recommend professional courtesy because a lot of times, if that lease is ending in February, the tenants are likely talking about their lines of credits. They might be purchasing chemical prior to that. So I always recommend that professional courtesy of letting them know if you're going to go a different route, whether that lease ends the last day or not. It's just a courteous thing to do.
Okay, very good. Why don't you go ahead and take the lead on the first couple questions here?
Okay. Okay, so when should the cash rent be due from my crop or grazing land lease? So it really depends on the parties involved, but I don't think it's unfair to ask half prior to planting because remember we have taxes due twice a year, and then half somewhere around that harvest date. You can split it up into 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. But I do think it's not it's not unreasonable to ask half before planting and half around harvest. Maybe they have some cattle to sell during that time or not, but at least not the entire cash rent is going to be sitting on that line of credit for 7 months or 6 months, whatever the case might be.
Okay, very good.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, go ahead and take this one too.
Okay, who should pay the bill if the tenant hires a third-party company to make the repairs on the pivot, the landlord or the tenant? Again, this is a depends question. It's going to be what have you guys talked about? What do you guys have in your lease? Again, a good lease is going to cover this. So if it's within the deductible, then the tenant should cover that. If it's outside of that deductible, then the landowner is going to be covering it. I think it's important to have the open communication lines that, like I said, that 4th of July example there. Be willing to talk to each other because corn might be burning up, but when it's 3 times the normal rate, that adds up really fast too.
All right, very good. Hey, let's I'm going to interject one question we hear. It kind of relates to some of the things you've been talking on, and almost relates to this one too here. The question that was asked is who typically prepares the lease? Is it the landlord or the tenant? The tenant or the landowner? And my comment I wanted to make on this question here was it's typically the landowner. Obviously, with that, you can have input from the other party. Leases are negotiable. The owner of the property is ultimately the one that gets to determine the terms of the lease. Now they have to find some way that's going to agree with it. But traditionally speaking, it's the landowner that puts the lease together with input, setting provisions from the tenant as well.
We always say that you can put whatever you want in a lease. You just have to find somebody who will agree to it and actually follow it.
Yep. All right, I'll take this one or a shot at it. Who should I rent my land out on a single or multi-year lease arrangement? Anastasia hinted at this throughout the thing. I think everybody should be in agreement. It's a good thing to be working with someone for multiple years, 5, 10, 20 decades at a time. Whatever terms you set in that lease, if you want to set a multi-year lease, the suggestion is considering that multi-year lease, you might want to consider setting terms where you renegotiate the cash rent down or up, subject to the profitability of what's occurring that year. Single year leases allow for greater flexibility. The challenge is many tenants want to have a multi-year lease because they want to have a situation where they can they want to get the benefits. When they fertilize or do a really good job farming, some of the things that they do on your property are going to last more than a year. Certain types of fertilizer, for example. That's why they would like a multi-year lease. If you're going to do single year, you can always have the agreement. Hey, you're going to be renting my land for a significant number of years to come up here. Well, let's just do a single year lease, just given how uncertain the rainfall is or commodity prices or anything like that. So if you want to do multi-year, that's fine. But just know that we want to have ability to renegotiate up or down to accurately reflect whatever type of crop or livestock that you have out there. Okay, we can go to the next slide now.
Okay. Can I be forced to provide an easement on my land to allow a carbon or hydrogen pipeline to be built? Well, in Nebraska, you have to be a common carrier in order to qualify for eminent domain and to be forced to put it in. So right now, no, carbon pipelines are not considered common carriers. So you can't be forced. No, not right now. However, infrastructure such as petroleum, natural gas pipelines, electrical transmissions, all of those that transport the public's energy do qualify. So you could be forced to put one of those in. But this map here, it has a proposed carbon pipeline. You cannot be forced to put that in your land unless it is a something that uses that public energy. So whether it's natural gas, petroleum, or electrical right now in the state of Nebraska.
If I'm not mistaken, in the state of Nebraska right now, I think the portion of the Nebraska line may be under construction based on my travels of the state over the last month or two here. I think it's a little bit more up in the air when it comes to South Dakota and some of the things surrounding that with their state legislature. But it appears that there's still a desire to go forward with this process. And I think the ultimate goal is, if I'm not mistaken, I think they want to liquefy the carbon and stick it in a cave or an underground geological formation of some type up there in North Dakota's ultimate destination for it under current policies put forward. Okay. All right. And what about wind turbines? Or we also got questions coming in occasionally about solar developments. Well, wind turbines or solar panels are not a common carrier. Okay, they are an actual thing that's generating electricity. Now, the generation of electricity from solar panel development side or wind turbines, for example, where they have to cut through the countryside, they put in these great big electrical towers that are made out of galvanized angle iron or pipe or whatever they're made out of. They can use an easement to get access to the land to do that. But the actual wind generation site itself, that is voluntary. And that's subject to regulations at the local level. It seems like I've read different things in the news as of late about counties placing setback requirements. So if you want to put up a wind turbine, unless the neighbors voluntarily agree, you have to be so many feet or half a mile or whatever the number is from existing residential structures, because some of these wind turbines, for example, give off different types of sound when they are in operation. And if you're ever approached with the opportunity or does interest from someone to build some of these type of structures on your property, whether it's a wind turbine, solar panel, or whatever, always talk to an attorney or those folks that are licensed to work in the real estate world. There are different strategies associated with negotiating these rents, and we want to set a cash rental rate that represents the interest of those parties involved. So talk to attorneys, people that work that have experience in these areas. If you do get approached with a desire for someone to build these structures or somebody that needs an easement to run whatever across your ground, talk to someone. Okay. All right.
Okay. So what about solar panels? Can you be forced to provide an easement for solar panel development? So again, these solar panels typically run a 20 to 30-year lease. You cannot be forced to put in solar panels on your property. However, you could be forced to put in the transmission lines that transport the power from the solar panels to whatever electrical line is. But if you have questions, specific questions on this, again, we recommend that you consult an attorney if you're approached about this.
Okay. Yeah, and solar panel leases, the big difference between solar and wind on that prior slide, keep in mind, most solar developments, you're not pouring in excess of 75 or 100 yards of concrete to secure the base of the structure. You know, when you build a wind turbine, there's a significant amount of concrete and rebar that goes into the ground. Solar, yes, they might pour a little concrete in there, but typically it's the type of things that could be removed from the site. It's a little bit different. It's not to say it's not a commitment, but it's a little bit different than what wind might be. So, okay, are there any other questions? I'm not seeing anything. There's been some questions that's come in. We got the question and chat pane open in here in front of me. Anything else?
I'll address one while people have the chance to open up the chat and enter some more in. We were asked, are there gravity irrigated cash rents for high, average, and low? And yes, there are. You can find them in the real estate report.
Okay. Yep. And as a reminder, we're going to post the slides from today. And in there, you'll have both the UNL, the USDA, and there's also links to where there's been some information put in the webinar chat today on where you can find these updates as well. So please take a look. All right. We had one question come in the chat right now, Anastasia. I'll go ahead and read it off for you and you can think about it here for a minute.
Yeah.
Should your tenant provide you with yields in terms of the bushel per acre and a cash rent situation? Is that a yes or a no? And why might someone provide that, or why would they maybe not want to provide that?
Yeah, so if you ask and it's not in your written lease, they don't have to provide it. They don't have to give their 10-year production history. They don't have to. Now, if you really want it, I recommend that you put it in a lease saying that you want to know how how your field is producing. I will say the caveat with that is a lot of times, farmers can be their own worst enemy, and maybe they talk about their one field that did amazing, but they don't talk about the other field that was a complete bust that had to be chopped for silage. So it's a lot like those fish stories. Um, so always be cautious when you're hearing other people talk about their yields, their cash rent situations, because you always hear about the highs, but you never hear about the more reasonable tails. I also caution if you were to ask me for my APH today, I do not have to share with you my history. I could just start sharing from this year going on. I do also urge people to consider a lot of farmers nowadays are going on enterprise units. So what enterprise units are? I farm, let's say, 2 fields in one section. Those 2 fields are going to be insured together as an enterprise. And so both field A and B are going to be combined in that APH for that insurance policy. So it's not just going to be your field that you own, field A. It's going to be A and B combined. So I always just like to caution that when you're asking about APH. Is there anywhere else to get the bushels per acre if not from your tenant? So for your specific field, no. You can get a county level what the average is. The best way I would say to get that would be the Farm Bill uses a 5-year average, and it drops the high, it drops the low, and it has a plug. And I would say that's probably the most reasonable average right now to use if you can't get one from your tenant. If you are asking your tenant, I think it's important just to, communicate why you want it.
Okay. Let's go through the final slides here, Anastasia. There's a few things I wanted to point out here quick, and we have a few more questions we'll address too. Let's go to the next slide. Just want to know that this is the first time we're announcing this. Our landlord tenant cash rent meeting series that Jessica Groskopf, Shannon Sand, and Anastasia and myself have helped out with over the winter meeting series here. We are going to be doing an online version of this program. You'll see the website link here to register for it, and it'll highlight some of what we talked about today, but we're going to go a little more in depth. And just be aware that if you would like to attend, you have to register. And if you register and provide us with your address, we will send you a packet, just like if you walked into one of our in-person meetings, which includes those USDA and UNL cash rents. And the cash rental rate information in there will be for 2025 from UNL and 2024 from the USDA, those maps that we've seen. So please be aware of that. And there's 2 different times, similar information both, but the examples will be a little bit different between the 25th and the 27th. But so if you own land in the eastern part, but you can only attend live on the 25th, just come on the 25th. That's fine. And just be aware that these programs will be archived. And let's go to the next slide here for a second. Let's go one more. This is the upcoming meetings that we have scheduled for in mid-May. Just be aware that we have a variety of topics. We're going to be covering the upcoming trends in 2025 cash rent. And please be aware that there's a variety of topics here that will be covered. So, okay, we had a whole bunch of questions come in here, Anastasia.
Okay.
Okay, I'll take the first one here. Question is, people should talk to their county planning and zoning committee members and others in the area regarding transmission lines, solar and wind developments. One attorney may have received money or some other benefits from the various energy development companies. Well, when it comes to hiring an attorney, you need to be hiring an attorney that is representing your interests, and they would not have a conflict of interest. So if an attorney has worked for an energy company before and they need to represent your interests in a contract or a lease negotiation surrounding the wind development or whatever is occurring, it would be a conflict of their interest. So yes, you need to find someone that is not in conflict of interest, that has not represented other parties in a matter that you're negotiating on. And that's just not for lease contract negotiations surrounding energy or easements. That goes for everything in life. That's why some attorneys won't represent you, because they maybe have dealt with a different client that has conflicting interests in what you do. And that's why you always need to seek out a party that's representing there. Okay, Anastasia, do you want to take the next one?
Yep, I can take one. So we'd like to move away from pesticides and incorporate ground cover and biochar. How would you introduce that in a lease? So first off, I would talk to your tenant that, hey, just have the conversation. You want to move away from it. What could they incorporate into their lease? Or because it might be something that you need to find a new tenant. And if that's the case, you need to terminate the lease with them and find somebody who's willing to work with you on the goals for your ground. But I would at least start having that conversation and then putting it in writing in your lease that this is what you want to have done. And make sure it's reasonable. I always talk about, do your provisions in your lease make sense? So a lot of times I will revert back to, like, if it's organic, great, keep your field organic. It took a while to get there, but you really can't have an organic clause in there and a no-till clause, because those two production practices contradict each other. So make sure that your lease provisions are reasonable.
Okay. All right. The question here, I have to make this out the best I can. Basically, and I think this gets back to the point that we tried to make when we were covering the cash rents. How much do you take off the irrigation system if the tenant is the one providing a portion of the irrigation component? So if they're providing everything, including the pivot and the power unit, as we stated before, you could see a discount anywhere from maybe $45 to $60 an acre off if they are the ones providing both the pivot and the power unit. If they are someone that, in addition to that, let's say you have two neighboring 80-acre parcel of lands. One is irrigated, the tenant owns everything on it, and then you have a dry land 80 that they happen to swing their pivot on your property. Okay. If that's the case, and the tenant truly is providing everything, well, you would probably wouldn't be charging a full irrigated rate, and you may not even discount it. This comes to the point that, yes, the landowner, if their ground is irrigated, they will be charged higher real estate taxes on the acres that the pivot can cover. So at the same time, the tenant's responsible just not for the pivot and the power unit. They're also the ones that are taking care of the pumping of the water, the below ground improvements. It just happens that the pivot's swinging on it. So what are they paying in cash rent? Well, they're not paying a center pivot rate, and they're not paying a dry land rate. They're probably paying something in between it. How much? It really comes down to the negotiation between the two involved. All right, Anastasia, we got 2 questions. Which one do you want to take?
I'll piggyback off my last question I answered. Does the landowner share in the cover crop expense if they want them? My recommendation is if the landowner is wanting the cover crops, it might be reasonable to share in that expense because is it providing any value to the tenant, or are you doing them because you want them and are you getting cost share on it? It might be something worth sharing an expense in it. Because depending on why you're planting them, it's one thing if a tenant can plant them and graze the cover crops. But if you're in a cost share that doesn't allow it, it adds some extra expenses of terminating and all of that. So I don't think it's unreasonable to share that cover crop expense if the landowner is asking for it.
Okay, I'll take the last question here. What economic factors are to be considered when negotiating a new 12-month cash rent lease? So I would imagine this might be someone that's negotiating a cropland cash rental rate that will be maybe taking effect here on the 1st of March or at some point in March. Things I would be keeping an eye out might differ a little bit based on if it's a cropland lease or a grazing land lease. I'm assuming it's a cropland if it's a 12-month. 1, profitability. Where are the input expenses at for this upcoming year, and what are the expectation for prices? 2, if it's this isn't necessarily economic, but irrigation availability, given if we're having a dry year possibly. So what does the economics of drought mean in terms of profitability and things surrounding that? When we talk about commodity or input prices, trade, we bring fertilizer into this country from other areas of the world and we export our grain. There's a lot of things in the news right now surrounding those things to the best of your ability. How does profitability look at? So I'd look at the economic forces guiding profitability of farming and ranching. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for participating today. And we had a very nice group join us once again. Be sure to register for our online event. And with that, we'll go ahead and sign off. I got 1:02 on my end, and I think we started at 12:02. Take care, everyone.